There we go. Hey, everyone. Hey, Destiny. We're
Hi,
live.
Lee.
There we go.
We are
How are
live.
you?
I am finding yourself.
I am doing good. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Just Talk Live Season 3, the pink season,
Yes, the pink
because we're not
season.
changing color this time go around.
That's right.
But welcome to the show, everyone. Destiny, I hope you're doing well, and it's really good to see you. It's always good to see you.
Likewise, and I'm glad to be here. We are your hosts, Destiny and Lee. And we
I
have a good
know.
lineup for you today.
We do have a good lineup. Today, we're going to be talking about reproductive justice. We're going to be talking about reproductive ethics, reproductive rights, all those things today. And we have two amazing guests with us, and we're just going to bring them up and invite them to introduce themselves. And so we are going to welcome our guest. Welcome, guest. We are so glad to have you. And please introduce yourself to the people. We'll start with Dr. Bond.
Greetings, and thank you for having me on the show, on the podcast. My name is Toni Bond. I am one of the 12 Black women who coined the term reproductive justice in 1994 and pretty much laid the foundation for reproductive justice movement. I am adjunct faculty at Claremont School of Theology in Claremont, California, where I teach Intro to Christian Ethics, and also at Methodist Theological School in Ohio, where I also teach Introduction to Christian Ethics. And I am currently the interim CEO of a group called Interfaith Voices for Reproductive Justice.
Hi, everyone. I'm Margaret Kamitsuka. Great to be here with Toni and with those of you doing this podcast. This is a great show that you're running. I'm Professor Emeritus of Religion at Oberlin College, where I taught for over 20 years in areas of religion and gender. And my area of research focus is the abortion issue. And my recent book that I published on this topic is Abortion and the Christian Tradition, a Pro-Choice Theological Ethic. And that's with Westminster John Knox Press.
Well, thank you so much for being here. This is definitely a topic of interest and also one that we need to talk about more, especially within church contexts. But before we dive into the good work that each of you are doing, let's just start a baseline of what reproductive justice is. There's a lot of myths, a lot of misconceptions, and I think if we can all can get on the same definition standard of what we are talking about here about reproductive justice, that will help our audience to know exactly what the discussion is for today.
Absolutely. Well, I'm happy to give that definition. And the most simple definition is that reproductive justice is the human right to decide to have a child, to not have a child, to parent the children that one has with the necessary social and economic supports that families need, not just to survive, but to thrive, and the human right to bodily autonomy and sexual pleasure. Reproductive justice rests upon the human rights framework and Black feminist theory, and brings in this intersectional analysis that recognizes that there is not just one singular, oftentimes, barrier that precludes individuals from being able to exercise their reproductive autonomy, but a multitude of barriers like race, class, gender, and age, so forth and so on, that oftentimes preclude individuals from being able to lead reproductive and sexually autonomous lives. And that those barriers oftentimes are not just singular, but are barriers that happen simultaneously. That an individual may be confronting barriers based upon their race and their class and their age. If we're talking about a woman or pregnant, capable person of color who also might be a young person. So that's the kind of short definition of reproductive justice.
And Margaret, the work that you also do, coming from, and I've been hearing a reproductive ethic. That also may be a good thing to also define, so we also know what that may mean. So I wonder if you
Mm.
might could speak to that a little bit in conjunction with reproductive justice. We're going to be using these terms, and I feel like we also just throw around terms sometimes, and we don't really know exactly what we're
Yeah.
saying. So I think that also might be helpful too. So maybe tell us what reproductive ethic is also, if that is helpful.
Yes, yeah, that's a great question. So, full disclosure, I'm not an ethicist. I'm a theologian, but my work is at the intersection of theology and ethics. I think most theologians today understand that theology is not just something that is theoretical, but has to speak about real people's experience. And so, the intersection of theology and ethics is really important when you are asking questions about what should Christian folk do? What focus should a church have? How can people come to a greater understanding of how to deal with the gray area that is much of reproductive lives? So ethics deals with issues of what's right and what's wrong, but it's mostly there to serve people getting through those gray area issues where there isn't clear instruction either from the historical religious tradition you're from the Bible, and so on. So reproductive ethics tries to help people think about all of the various dilemmas and challenges that people face in their reproductive lives, and to negotiate how to address them in conjunction with their faith practice and with the principles that they hold dear about what's true, what's good, and what makes for an abundant life.
And if I could just add a little bit, talking about the gray areas, right? And so when I think about reproductive ethics as an ethicist, oftentimes people conflate ethics and morality. And as Margaret said, many times people are confronted with these moral dilemmas about what they should do, for instance, around being pregnant, or what they should do in terms of whether to use contraception. And the ethics piece, the ethical piece, is kind of what are the rules that a group, a society, or an institution, or a collective of people have come up with. But the morality, the moral piece, is really what that individual believes. What are the principles and values that that particular individual holds? Sometimes the individual's morals and principles that they live their lives by may not necessarily mesh with the ethical principles of, or ethical rules of, for instance, their particular religious tradition. We need only look at the Catholic tradition. And we know that there are a number of Catholic individuals who are pro-choice, who believe that women and pregnant capable people should have the right to use methods of contraception. However, we know that the Catholic Church, under the directives of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, does not support individuals using contraception, and also individuals being able to obtain an abortion. So there is an ethical dilemma then, right, for that individual who might be confronted with an unintended pregnancy and trying to decide how do they hold true to the principles, the moral values that they hold, and also still kind of live in this religious tradition of being Catholic. So I think that really that points to what you were talking about, Margaret. That kind of gray area. How do people, grapple with those sorts of moral dilemmas?
Well, I think that is a good segue. Oh, it looks like you have something to say. Okay. I didn't want to cut you off. You had a comment to add in, like you. I think that's a good segue for our next question, though. Not only how do people, but how do we people who identify as Christian or with some type of faith religion grapple with these decisions around reproductive justice or reproductive ethics? Anyone can jump in and lean in, but I'm just wondering, what is our theology? If you want to talk as far as Christians say about reproductive justice or ethics, because there is again a disconnect to where you were speaking to, Dr. Bond. So I just want to hear more and go a little deeper about that.
I'm gonna hand it over to Margaret as the resident theologian.
Okay. Well, the point is that no one really has a definitive answer. I certainly don't have a definitive answer, but maybe I can talk a little bit about one model of how one might approach the issue of reproductive ethics for folks who are working with the Christian tradition, who turn to their Bible in some capacity for instruction. How would you go about this, given that the Bible says nothing about this? I mean, if you try and understand pregnancy in a biblical context, there's not very much there even about pregnancy, other than stories about biblical women battling infertility and trying to have a child so that they can have some social standing, in many stories in Hebrew Bible. So you're not going to find instruction about how to deal with pregnancies and all of the challenges that come with that in the Bible. But you can find certain principles about that give you sort of a general structure of how to think about what's right, what's wrong, and then what do you do when things are not clearly right or wrong, but you're in that gray area. So let's think about, something that's definitely wrong that you can get from the Bible. You could say that it goes against basic Christian principles of compassion to force someone into servitude or slavery. Okay, that's pretty basic within the biblical worldview. You can also say that there's sort of a clear what's right. It's good to be hospitable, right? That's a biblical principle. You can find that in the parable of the Good Samaritan. So then how do you take that right and that wrongness and apply it to the gray area of a challenging pregnancy in some capacity? Either it's mistimed, it's unwanted, it's unsafe, whatever someone might be facing, where they might be entertaining the option of terminating that pregnancy and wondering, is that right to do as a Christian? So we can think about that in terms of the parable of the Good Samaritan. Some might say, well, the principle of hospitality would say you must be hospitable to the developing life in the womb. But if you actually look at the story, that's not exactly the way hospitality played out in the parable. The Good Samaritan was very generous, gave of his time and gave of his money to save the wounded neighbor, but he didn't he didn't give of his body. And so here we can see we're now in the gray area, because now we're talking about hospitality that requires giving one's body. So I think we can say that, yes, hospitality is good, but forcing someone to give a gift of their very body, whether you're talking about something like organ donation or pregnancy, then you're talking about you've crossed a line beyond what the parable of the Good Samaritan tells us about the goodness of hospitality. So the moral of the story might be that if you're wondering about what might be an ethic, a reproductive ethic based on the parable of the Good Samaritan, you can say, well, it's unequivocally true that compassion and hospitality are good things. All right. And you could even say that the New Testament uses the language of love, but we could also say that it's a principle of love, or it's a principle of justice for compassion and hospitality. But forcing someone to give of their body or their bodily parts goes against Samaritan hospitality, because the Samaritan was not forced to do what he did. He did it out of generosity. So we might say that any kind of forced reproductive acts go against a compassionate and loving view and are unjust. So that would be just a sample of how thinking, ethical thinking, might proceed within a Christian context when you're in a great moral area.
And that also kind of leads to the conversation of reproductive justice in a way that, there's always these things have become so politicized in such a way that we always call it like the one issue vote. Like, this is the one issue. Abortion is the one thing that many people focus on, so much so that now that reproductive justice has challenged this one way of looking at things and saying, actually, bringing a person into this world and not having the systems in place to support said person is moving beyond like a one vote issue or a one politicized issue. And as we're thinking like theologically, this wholeness of life comes to mind as well. How are we to live into a wholeness of ourselves and who we are as human beings? And so, Dr. Bond, would you also say that is something else that is added into this conversation, this idea of wholeness, which to me, as a person of faith and as a Christian specifically, I think is pretty foundational to a lot of faith traditions, if not many of them. So I wonder about that in the conversation with reproductive justice, this idea of wholeness, maybe. I think you're unmuted. I'm sorry.
Sorry about that. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think when you look at the four tenets of reproductive justice, that's why we say reproductive justice is about the human right to have a child, not have a child, raise your children with the social economic support you need to thrive, and bodily autonomy and sexual pleasure. What has unfortunately seemed to have happened over the past couple of years is that people have applied this really reductionist understanding of what reproductive justice is and have very pointedly focused on abortion. But when you look at the true meaning of reproductive justice, it is about wholeness. It is about not just an individual being able to make the decision to not have a child, but also to have a child, with the understanding that oftentimes folks aren't able to have children owing to a number of circumstances. It may be owing to infertility. It may be owing to not having the social and economic supports they need to really care for a child in a way that that child can thrive. And also reproductive justice, again, brings in this, like I said, this intersectional analysis, as Margaret was talking about the principles that we can find in the Bible, the rules, the ways in which we should live our lives in accordance with. Likewise, when you look at, for instance, the story of the midwives in the Exodus narrative, you see a couple of things. You see this principle about thou shalt not kill, right? Because we know, as the story goes, that the Pharaoh had ordered the two midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, to kill all male Hebrew babies, but they refused to do so. And when the Pharaoh challenged them and asked why, the midwives responded that the women had their babies before they were even able to before they arrived and before they were able to assist. And so a couple of things. You have the midwives, and it's really the way that you interpret the text, right? But you have the midwives saying, no, we are not going to kill children. And in fact, by that very act, they supported the women in having agency. And so there is this aspect of reproductive justice that I think is very beneficial and supports the way that we interpret the text through oftentimes a feminist lens and a womanist lens that helps us to draw out those areas of where individuals have agency, exercise agency, and also where we see systematic oppression, where we see, for instance, the Pharaoh ordering the midwives to kill the male Hebrew children, and also where we see where it highlights the ways in which women and pregnant capable people survive under systems of oppression. So reproductive justice is very broad and does contribute to this deeper understanding of wholeness.
Can I tag along? Yes. So I think that what's really helpful about the RJ approach is an insistence on this principle of wholeness, because the metaphor or the concept of choice, while important and still part of many activities and political efforts for reproductive rights around the world, is still too narrow. And choice doesn't really get to some of the issues about what's blocking the ability to foster wholeness, including wholeness in one's reproductive lives within the church settings. And part of the problem is that when you get to the reproductive dilemma, it's way too late to be starting to talk about the issues that need to have. The conversation already has to have been started on those issues prior to the crisis issue. So, for example, you need to have more openness in the church talking about sex. All right. So Christians have sex. They get pregnant unexpectedly. Sometimes they need not to be pregnant for many reasons. Sometimes they need help in completing their pregnancy. But there's little foundation in the church to talk about sex and pregnancy. And so pregnant people, when they're in a kind of a crisis situation or at some kind of a dilemma, that's not the point at which they're going to open up the discussion with their fellow church members. So the term that sort of talks about this silencing of people around reproductive issues is stigma. So there's stigma against everything related to sex pretty much in the Christian tradition. And there's a long historical reason for that we don't need to get into now. But I think people pretty much understand that the Christian tradition is pretty much sex phobic and anti-body generally. So there's stigma against people having sex. There's particular stigma against Christian women having sex or unmarried people having sex. There's some stigma growing about even using contraception now. This is growing even in the Protestant tradition. But there's stigma paradoxically, against people having their contraception fail. There's stigma against even just wanting to have an abortion. There's stigma against feeling relief that one had a miscarriage for an unwanted pregnancy. There's all these stigmas that are wrapped up around reproductive issues related to sex and so on. And these have to be talked about more openly to set a foundation so that when there is some kind of a moral dilemma, you have a basis for talking about these broader topics within which reproductive ethics is situated.
I'm glad you brought in the troubling with the term choice or pro-choice. You're absolutely right. When we talk about reproductive and sexual health and rights, and that is the kind of expanded again definition of reproductive justice, because it acknowledges the fact that when we use the term choice, choice implies that people have access to this vast marketplace of options that they really don't have oftentimes, particularly when we talk about people who are social and economically disadvantaged. And the conversation about how the church does and does not talk about sex, you're absolutely right. It's the one conversation, ironically, that the church shies away from. And having sex is the way that most of us get here. all of us get here, right? It's because two individuals have had sex or through assisted reproductive technologies. But there is this ethical conversation that needs to happen around the church not talking about human sexuality, particularly when many people, especially young people, are not introduced fully to conversations or issues around reproductive and sexual health in the school system. And that oftentimes parents, families have struggled with. How do you have this conversation about human reproduction and human sexuality? And so, what is the role of the church? What should be the role of the church in providing support to families engaging in this kind of conversation, and then also providing some guidance to families and individuals around these conversations, and then thereby the moral dilemmas that are oftentimes associated with human reproduction and human sexuality?
And I also, and this is a question I always struggle with, because how I grew up, we didn't learn a thing about sex, and we sure didn't learn about sex in the church. That was just not going to happen. And but it is something that we are hearing more and more in the church. I mean, I just watched a TV show last night, and there were young people on there that didn't know, like, exactly where the uterus was or where ovaries were, or some of the guys didn't even recognize, like, I mean, like a urethra, like things things like that are very different things, like you wouldn't necessarily know unless you study that, or like even the scientific like terms for things. And so I how do you see the church or like communities of faith being able to foster that in a way that isn't like what happened on Mean Girls? Like, if you have sex, like you're basically gonna get something, and or you're gonna die from it, or like something that is so terrifying, and something that is so fearful of, like a lot of these like scare tactics that people have towards it. But how do you see, and the church has done that a lot in many ways, has perpetuated that, but how might both of you see the church being a space that is open, or able to have these conversations in a way that, as we're talking about wholeness, that kind of perpetuates, this wholeness that we're trying to center? How might you see the church doing that?
Well, if I can sort of bring a theological point to this, because we theologians are not very practical. Although I will say that I know that the Unitarian Universalist Church has a great curriculum on sexuality. So there are some, but I don't know whether the PC USA Church has one. But that would be great if more churches did develop those curriculum materials. But it's not talking about sexual health and sexual ethics is not only important just for from a sort of a public health perspective, which is reason enough there, but there is a theological requirement actually to talk about this. I mean, if you start with what does it mean to be a human person, the clearest teaching we have about this is that people are created in the image of God. Now, the tradition originally thought about that image of God as being something that was in your head. It was your rational capacity. But if you actually look at the Genesis text, the conferring of the image of God went right along with talking about sex, multiplying and reproducing, and also taking care of the creation, the created world. So, I mean, theologically, you should not disassociate the image of God from sexual identity and all of the things we do simply to survive, which is care for our environment, our planet, and so on. So there's an actual theological requirement not to ignore this, and then sort of rely on those folks who are able to develop curricula to now actually develop the pastoral and the educational curricula that can be used in the churches.
Absolutely. And just to add just a little bit to that, we know how important knowledge is in Christianity. And along with this line of thinking that if we're all created in the image of God and God has all knowledge, then if we as humans are created in God's image, we need access to that knowledge too. And that part of that knowledge includes knowledge about our bodies and and guidance around how we as human beings engage in human sexuality and engage in human sexuality in ways that respect people's autonomy and that is liberative, and also that sex should be enjoyed. So there is a role for the sharing of and building of knowledge, even in the Christian tradition, especially around issues of human sexuality and human reproduction.
I want to leave room for each of you individually to talk more about the area expertise that you work when in regards to reproductive justice or ethics, and also Margaret, to hear a little bit more about your book if you're interested in sharing as well. Um, so just leaving space for that to happen. I know Dr. Bond has to leave soon.
Toni, why don't you go first in case you have to, go to your class?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I'll have to jump off in a bit. My work really is centered at the intersections of religion and reproductive justice, and specifically around reproductive and sexual ethics, and thinking through not just what the individual should and should not do in terms of those moral dilemmas, but what is the role of the church around those moral dilemmas. So again, using the example of the Catholic tradition and other traditions that may have, for instance, hospital facilities. What is the role of those religious traditions that operate care facilities and provide healthcare services? How should they be providing care and services to the people who come to them for medical treatment? And so that's really where my work is centered. As the interim CEO of Interfaith Voices for Reproductive Justice, a lot of that work is done through IVRJ. And Interfaith Voices for Reproductive Justice works with religious scholars, theologians, and ethicists, and also with religious leaders to come together and think through, what does pastoral care curriculum look like? What are some of those conversations we need to have to dismantle oppressive theological teachings that serve as barriers to individuals being able to make decisions about their reproductive and sexual lives? What kind of guidance can be provided to church leaders in terms of sermons that are supportive of reproductive and sexual autonomy, that talk about reproductive ethics and sexual ethics? So that's where my work has been situated.
Yeah, thanks, Toni. That is really great work that you do. So the book that I did, Abortion in the Christian Tradition, one of the reasons I wrote that is to try and clarify a lot of misinformation that is out there from more pro-life sectors of society, claiming that the Christian position is an anti-abortion position, and trying to argue that case based on certain verses in the Bible or certain statements of ancient authorities in the church, from the early church especially. And so I try to critique those and clarify what's wrong about the way in which the Bible is being read by some of these pro-choice writers, and the taking verses out of context that early church theologians may have said regarding abortion. So that's a clarifying operation. But I'm also really interested in sort of moving forward more positively about how we can think and talk about reproductive issues generally. And here I wouldn't just narrowly look at the abortion issue. And the church really has some making up for a lack of addressing pastoral issues regarding reproductive lives. So, for example, miscarriage is rarely talked about. It's almost absent from the liturgical tradition of most liturgies that various denominations offer. When someone has a miscarriage, it's very difficult to find liturgical support or pastoral support for that experience. Where you do find it, then there tends to be a sort of dividing line that's made between people who have a miscarriage experience and those who have an abortion experience, as if these are two separate and mutually exclusive groups of people, when in fact they could very well be the same person. So, and there's a moralizing that happens of these. In other words, the person who has a miscarriage is a victim, a good mother who has had this tragic situation happen to her. You might find that kind of language. Whereas the person who's had an abortion is the classic bad mother, made a bad choice, an evil choice, a sinful choice, and so on. And this kind of moralizing separates the women into groups, and then you have other groups that are put in there too. So, for example, people who are struggling with infertility and so on. But really, these are more of a continuum. These are a spectrum of reproductive experiences that many people have in the long decades when one might get pregnant and have these various different experiences. So I'm very interested in trying to get the church to talk differently about all of these experiences and never talk about them separate from each other. So I think that's really important, that you don't try and, wall off one group of people from another group of people, as if there's one group is good, one is bad, one's virtuous, one's sinful, one's tragic, one's, and so on. These sorts of ways in which things have been addressed is very detrimental. Again, it's stigmatizing. It's not good pastoral care. So that's an area of interest that I have right now.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And just real quickly, Dr. Bond has a class to attend and to be the professor of. And so, Dr. Bond, thank you so much for being with us. It is an honor to be with you and for you to be here with us. And so, thank you so much for being with us and for all that you do.
Thank you so much for having me on the show. And Margaret, it's always a pleasure to share space with you.
Thank you. It was good to see you.
You too.
Blessings.
You as well.
Thank you again.
Bye.
Yeah, that it's so good. It's so great to meet her. And Margaret, maybe as we come to a close, it might be a good idea, maybe for some. I know you said as a theologian, maybe not always practical things, but there may be some practical things, and people in the pews that may want to begin to have these conversations within their faith communities, within a lot of things, and that they may be trying to do in their churches. I know right now, there is a lot of conversation happening in the church about reproductive justice, about things as wholeness within our beings, and also relationships and things of that nature. So what are some things that you know of that we can offer them as we can close out today?
Yeah, so I think if I can just plug a resource that I
Of
think would
course.
be really great. This is not just for those in the Christian tradition, but anyone in a wide variety of religious traditions. But that's the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, the RCRC, which is an online space where people can find resources about from their faith traditions, and also just general resources about thinking about these wide spectrum of issues that we've been talking about. Spiritual resources to help one, for example, get through a reproductive loss, or to think through an abortion decision, and also after abortion care. So this is one very neglected area, and this goes back to what I was just talking about. All of the post-abortion care that you find readily accessible in churches and also in online spaces is mostly pro-choice. And actually, a lot of the post-miscarriage care is also, is pro-life, is also very pro-life, which is difficult because people are looking for a compassionate space to share their stories. But unfortunately, what they get in return is a sort of a very rigid script that they have to follow, and the way in which they have to talk about what they lost, or the decision that they made. So whereas people's experience of either miscarriage or abortion, very diverse. Not everyone thinks about it as a lost child, but some people do. And so there needs to be more resources, and the RCRC, the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, is developing some resources that you can access through their website that offers these kinds of help for those who come from a faith tradition and would like to understand how spirituality can intersect with their reproductive lives rather than being unconnected whatsoever.
Well, thank you so much for that. And thank you for sharing a different narrative around not only reproductive justice, but how to think about it in a theological sense and approach. I appreciate the story you use to help literally walk through how we could think about the Bible and the social justice aspect around reproductive justice and ethics. So thank you for that.
And we put the links in the comments. So we also put the links to the resource that Margaret just mentioned, but also we put the link to Dr. Bond, the Interfaith Voices for Reproductive Justice link in the comments as well. And so people can go to those on YouTube, on Facebook, and you can click them and find that. And again, Margaret, we thank you for being with us today. And thank you, for the work that you are doing. So this has been wonderful. This has been a good day.
Well, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. These are really important podcasts that you're making, and a great benefit to all of the people who tune in.
Awesome. Yeah, we appreciate it. And to our viewers out there, you can find this video on the Unbound YouTube channel. You can even now go to www.youtube.com/unbound. Hold on. Yeah, I think that's it. Unbound YouTube /Unbound YouTube. But we can put the link in there to find the video. It'll be on our Facebook, and you can catch us again in 2 weeks. We are going to have Native and Indigenous voices with us to talk about Native and Indigenous rights and how we can be in solidarity with our siblings who are a part of that community, and also plug an Unbound Lenten devotional. I'll plug it right now. It's called With Creation, a Native and Indigenous Lenten devotional that will run from February the 22nd, which is Ash Wednesday, all the way up until Easter. You can go to justiceunbound.org/withcreationlent. It will be published on February 19th. And yeah, we can journey with our Native and Indigenous siblings during this Lenten time. And so, again, to Margaret, thank you. And Destiny, it's always good to see you.
Likewise, Lee. And it was very nice meeting you, Margaret.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right. And until next time, y'all.
Next time.
Bye.